Rejected by his mom, this leopard was raised like a human baby. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly before Chuck Whitmore as he trudged through the knee-deep snow that had fallen during the night. At 73, his weathered face bore the lines of countless seasons spent in these mountains, each wrinkle telling a story of storms weathered and wildlife encountered. The January morning was particularly brutal, with temperatures hovering near 20 below zero and winds that cut through even his heaviest winter gear like invisible knives. Chuck pulled his wool cap lower over his graying hair and adjusted the scarf that protected his neck from the biting wind. His breath formed crystalline clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the dry mountain air. And each step he took created a satisfying crunch that echoed through the silent forest. These morning patrols had become a ritual since his retirement from the Forest Service 5 years earlier. A way to maintain his connection with the wilderness that had defined his entire adult life. The trail he followed was one he had walked thousands of times over his 4-decade career. First as a young ranger, eager to prove himself, then as a seasoned professional, who understood the delicate balance between human interference and natural preservation. Even in retirement, he felt a responsibility to these mountains and the creatures that called them home. His cabin, nestled 3 miles from the nearest conservation center, served as an unofficial way station for injured wildlife and a repository of knowledge that younger rangers often sought. As he approached the familiar bend near Willow Creek Ravine, something unusual caught his attention. The forest, typically alive with the subtle sounds of winter, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the rustle of small creatures moving through underbrush, the occasional crack of a tree branch weighted down by ice, had fallen into an unnatural silence. Chuck paused, his experienced senses immediately alert to the change in atmosphere. Then he heard a low, trembling growl that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. The sound was weak but unmistakable, carrying a note of desperation that made his chest tighten with concern. In all his years in these mountains, Chuck had encountered black bears, mountain lions, and wolves, but this vocalization was different, more exotic, more distressed than anything he had heard before, following the sound with the methodical patience that had served him throughout his career. Chuck carefully descended into the ravine, using his walking stick to test each step on the potentially unstable snow. The temperature dropped noticeably as he moved lower, and the wind created eerie whistling sounds as it moved through the bare branches overhead. The growling grew more distinct, more urgent, and Chuck found himself moving with increasing caution as he realized he was approaching a predator in distress. When he finally located the source of the sound, the sight that greeted him was both heartbreaking and alarming. Partially concealed beneath a thin layer of fresh snow lay a female leopard, her magnificent rosette-patterned coat matted with dried blood and forest debris. Her left hind leg was caught in what appeared to be an illegal trap, the cruel steel jaws having bitten deep into muscle and bone. The animal's golden eyes, though dulled by pain and exhaustion, still held the fierce intelligence of an apex predator. Chuck's mind immediately began calculating the implications of what he was seeing. Leopards were not native to Montana's ecosystem, which meant this animal was either an escapee from a private collection or had been deliberately released by someone who could no longer care for her. The trap itself was another concern. Illegal snares had been a persistent problem in the area, set by poachers who showed little regard for conservation laws or animal welfare. "Easy, girl," Chuck murmured softly, maintaining a respectful distance while reaching for his satellite phone. Even injured and trapped, a leopard remained one of nature's most formidable predators, capable of inflicting serious damage if she felt threatened. His experienced eye noted the telltale swelling of her sides that indicated advanced pregnancy, adding another layer of urgency to an already critical situation. The call to Glacier Wildlife Conservation Center was answered immediately by Dr. Sara Martinez, the facility's head veterinarian, and Chuck's former colleague from his ranger days. Her voice crackled with static through the satellite connection. But her professional concern came through clearly as Chuck described the situation. A pregnant leopard in a trap. Dr. Martinez's voice carried both disbelief and immediate alarm. Chuck, are you certain about the species identification? We haven't had any reports of missing exotic cats in the region. 40 years in these mountains. Sarah, I know what I'm looking at, Chuck replied, his eyes never leaving the trapped animal. She's been here for days, maybe longer, dehydrated, exhausted. And that leg, he paused, studying the extent of the visible injuries. You're going to need the full emergency response team. The rescue operation that followed was a testament to the professionalism and dedication of the Conservation Center staff. Within 2 hours, a specialized team had arrived with tranquilizer equipment, hydraulic tools to open the trap, and a mobile veterinary unit equipped for emergency surgery. Chuck watched from a safe distance as they worked, his heart clenching at the sight of the leopard's weak struggles. As the sedative took effect, Dr. Martinez worked with quiet efficiency, her hands moving over the unconscious animal with the practiced touch of someone who had spent decades treating injured wildlife. The trap had done significant damage, crushing bone and severing muscle tissue in a way that would require extensive surgical intervention. More concerning was the animal's overall condition. Severe malnutrition that spoke of weeks or months of inadequate care before her escape or abandonment. Someone clearly had no idea how to properly care for an exotic cat. Dr. Martinez muttered as they loaded the leopard into the transport vehicle. The malnutrition alone could have killed her, even without the trap injuries. And being pregnant in this condition, she shook her head grimly. Leaving the implications unspoken, Chuck followed the convoy back to the conservation center, an inexplicable pull keeping him invested in the leopard's fate. Perhaps it was the look he had glimpsed in her eyes before the tranquilizer took effect. Not just pain and exhaustion, but a profound sadness that resonated with something deep in his own soul. He had seen that expression before in animals, who had been failed by the humans who were supposed to protect them. The surgical suite at the conservation center became a hub of intense activity as Dr. Martinez and her team worked to save both mother and unborn cub. Chuck waited in the observation area, watching through reinforced glass as they carefully cleaned and treated the leopard's wounds. The trap had shattered bones in her left hind leg, requiring the insertion of metal pins, an extensive reconstruction of damaged tissue. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours, during which Chuck found himself pacing the hallway like an expectant father. She's stable, Dr. Martinez reported when she finally emerged from surgery, exhaustion evident in her voice. The leg will heal, though she'll always have a limp. But Chuck, her condition is worse than I initially thought. This isn't just malnutrition from being trapped. She's been struggling for months. Someone acquired this animal illegally, had no idea how to care for her, and then probably released her when they couldn't handle the responsibility. Chuck nodded grimly, familiar with the pattern. Exotic pet ownership had become an increasing problem as people sought unusual companions without understanding the enormous responsibility involved. Big cats required specialized diets, veterinary care, and living conditions that few private individuals could provide. The inevitable result was animals like this leopard, abandoned to fend for themselves in environments where they had no hope of survival. What about the pregnancy? Chuck asked, noting the careful way Dr. Martinez avoided discussing the unborn cub. Still viable? Remarkably, but given her condition, the stress of the surgery, and the trauma she's endured, Dr. Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. Even if she gives birth successfully, there's no guarantee she'll be able to care for the cub. Trauma can disrupt maternal instincts in ways we don't fully understand. 3 days after the surgery, as if summoned by some primal timing, the leopard went into labor. Chuck had taken to spending his days at the center, helping where he could and maintaining his quiet vigil. When the contractions began, he found himself pressed against the observation window, watching with the same nervous energy he might have felt, waiting for news of a grandchild's birth. The labor was long and difficult, complicated by the mother's weakened condition and the stress of her unfamiliar surroundings. Chuck watched as the veterinary staff monitored her vital signs and provided what support they could without interfering with the natural process. When the cub finally emerged after nearly 8 hours, Chuck felt a surge of relief and joy that surprised him with its intensity. The newborn was tiny, wet, and mewing with the piercing cry that seemed to be universal among all mammalian infants. For a brief moment, Chuck allowed himself to hope that the worst was over, that the natural process of bonding between mother and offspring would now take over. But as the minutes passed and the staff attempted to encourage nursing behavior, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The mother leopard, despite her exhaustion, deliberately turned away from her cub when the staff tried to position it for nursing. When they persisted, she bared her teeth and growled with a ferocity that seemed to drain what little energy she had left. Each attempt to encourage maternal behavior was met with increasing aggression, until the safety of both mother and cub required their separation. Sometimes severe trauma can completely disrupt the maternal instinct. Dr. Martinez explained to Chuck, though her voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. The stress of capture, the illegal conditions she was probably kept in, the trap, the surgery, any combination of these factors could have triggered this response. We've seen it before. Though rarely to this extreme, Chuck studied the mother through the glass, noting the hollow, distant expression in her eyes. She seemed to look through rather than at her surroundings, as if some essential part of her spirit had simply disconnected from reality. He had seen similar expressions in other traumatized animals over the years, and the prognosis was rarely optimistic. Recovery required not just physical healing, but a rebuilding of trust and psychological well-being that could take years to achieve. The cub, meanwhile, presented its own set of challenges that grew more critical with each passing hour. Despite the staff's expertise and best efforts, the tiny leopard refused every attempt at feeding. Specialized formula, different bottle types, various feeding positions. Nothing seemed to trigger the natural nursing response that would keep him alive. His pitiful mewing grew weaker as dehydration and hunger began to take their inevitable toll. If we can't get him to feed soon, we're going to lose him. Dr. Martinez confided to Chuck after the second day of failed attempts. Sometimes when they've been rejected completely, they just give up. The will to live seems to depend on that initial bonding. And without it, it was during one of these desperate feeding sessions that fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Chuck had been observing from his usual spot when he received an urgent phone call from his insurance company regarding storm damage to his cabin roof. In his hurry to discuss the repairs before the next weather system arrived, he forgot his old flannel shirt draped over the chair beside the observation window. The same shirt he had been wearing the day he discovered the mother leopard in the trap. When he returned from the 20-minute conversation, the scene before him defied all logical explanation. The cub, which had been listlessly refusing all attempts at feeding, was now pressed against the glass partition, its tiny nose twitching frantically as it tried to reach the fabric on the other side. For the first time since its birth, the small animal showed genuine animation, its weak mewing taking on an urgent, seeking quality. Dr. Martinez, Chuck called, his voice tight with excitement. You need to see this. The veterinarian hurried over, her eyes widening as she took in the dramatic change in the cub's behavior. Without hesitation, she retrieved the shirt and brought it into the cub's enclosure. The effect was immediate and profound. The tiny leopard buried his face in the worn fabric, inhaling deeply, while his paws began the instinctive kneading motion that preceded nursing. In all felines, when they offered a bottle this time, positioning it near the shirt so that Chuck's scent remained strong, the cub latched on immediately. He drank with the desperate hunger of an animal that had finally found something worth living for. His tiny body trembling with the effort of consuming as much nourishment as possible, the entire staff gathered to witness this small miracle, though none of them could offer a scientific explanation for what they were observing. "He's imprinted on you," Dr. Martinez said, wonder evident in her voice. "Not just your scent, but you specifically. I've read about this phenomenon in the literature, but I've never seen it happen so dramatically or so completely." Over the following days, the pattern became undeniable and absolute. The cub would only feed, sleep, or show any signs of contentment when Chuck's shirt was present in his enclosure. Remove the familiar fabric, and the tiny leopard would immediately become distressed, producing heartbroken vocalizations that could be heard throughout the center. It was as if Chuck had somehow become the cub's psychological anchor, filling the emotional void left by his biological mother's rejection. The situation presented the conservation center with an unprecedented challenge. The facility was already operating with reduced staff due to a respiratory illness outbreak that had affected several key personnel. Round the clock. Care for a newborn big cat required specialized knowledge, constant attention, and resources that were simply not available, given their current circumstances, as the cub grew stronger but remained utterly dependent on Chuck's presence. An unconventional solution began to take shape. Chuck Whitmore was hardly a typical candidate for surrogate parenthood. At 73, he lived alone in a modest log cabin, 3 miles from the conservation center. His nearest neighbor, another 2 miles down a winding mountain road that was often impassable during winter storms. Yet his qualifications were impeccable in ways that mattered most. During his ranger career, he had authored several training manuals on caring for orphaned wildlife and had successfully raised everything from bear cubs to wolf pups. More importantly, he possessed something that couldn't be taught or credentialed: an intuitive understanding of what wild animals needed to survive and thrive. After several lengthy meetings with the center's board of directors and extensive consultations with state wildlife officials, an unprecedented arrangement was approved. Chuck would assume primary care responsibilities for the cub under a specialized rehabilitation permit, with daily check-ins at the conservation center and regular veterinary oversight. His cabin and surrounding property met all the necessary safety and space requirements, and his proximity to the center ensured that professional help would always be available if needed. "I've been working in wildlife conservation for 25 years, and I've never approved anything quite like this," admitted James Henderson, the center's director, as he signed the final paperwork. "But then again, I've never seen anything quite like the bond between you and this cub. Sometimes we have to trust what nature is telling us, even when it doesn't fit our standard protocols." Chuck named the cub Leo, partly for his species and partly because the tiny leopard had shown such remarkable courage in fighting to survive against overwhelming odds. The transition from the sterile, controlled environment of the conservation center to Chuck's rustic mountain cabin could have been traumatic for any young animal. But Leo seemed to understand instinctively that he was finally going home. Wrapped in an old baby blanket that Chuck had discovered in his closet, a remnant from visits by grandchildren who had long since grown up and moved away, Leo settled into his new life. With an adaptability that amazed everyone who witnessed it, Chuck converted his spare bedroom into a nursery of sorts, complete with climbing structures appropriate for a developing big cat, toys that would stimulate his natural hunting instincts, and the ever-present blue flannel shirt that served as Leo's security blanket and connection to the human who had become his whole world. The early months were exhausting in the way that caring for any newborn can be, but complicated exponentially by Leo's unique needs as a wild animal developing in a domestic environment. Night feedings every 3 hours, constant temperature monitoring, the gradual introduction of solid foods, and the challenge of providing appropriate stimulation for a growing predator required a level of dedication that would have challenged someone half Chuck's age. Yet there were moments of pure magic that made every sleepless night and exhausting day worthwhile. The soft, rumbling purr that Leo produced whenever Chuck scratched behind his ears, a sound that seemed to emanate from his entire small body and vibrate through Chuck's chest when he held him. The gentle morning routine that developed organically, where Leo would pad into Chuck's bedroom at exactly 6:00 a.m., pressing his cold nose to Chuck's palm as the most effective and loving alarm clock imaginable. "No one's ever woken me this gently," Chuck would murmur, scratching Leo's head as the young leopard pressed against his side, purring with the deep contentment of an animal who had found his place in the world. As Leo grew from a helpless infant into a curious and increasingly active juvenile, his personality began to emerge in ways that constantly surprised and delighted Chuck. The cub developed an uncanny ability to read human emotions, seeming to sense when Chuck was tired, sad, or unwell, with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. During a particularly severe bout of bronchitis that winter, Leo abandoned his usual playful energy and instead became a devoted caregiver, lying quietly at Chuck's feet throughout the long nights and refusing to leave his side until the fever finally broke and normal health returned. Leo also appointed himself as the supervisor of Chuck's daily routines, particularly his morning ritual of personal hygiene. If Chuck attempted to skip brushing his teeth or washing his face, Leo would position himself strategically by the bathroom door, scratching gently at the wood and producing two distinct grunts, a vocalization that Chuck came to interpret as a firm but loving reminder that personal care was not optional. Even for surrogate fathers dealing with the demands of raising a big cat, the most endearing aspect of Leo's developing personality, however, was his absolute and unwavering devotion to that original blue-striped flannel shirt. As he grew from a tiny cub weighing less than 2 pounds into an adolescent leopard approaching 30 pounds, the shirt required constant modification to accommodate his increasing size. Chuck's limited sewing skills were put to the test repeatedly, as he let out seams, added fabric panels, and eventually transformed the simple garment into something resembling a blanket that could drape comfortably across Leo's powerful, developing shoulders. Even as Leo reached his full adult weight of 70 kilograms by his second birthday, he continued to think of himself fundamentally as Chuck's baby. Every evening, without fail, he would attempt to climb into Chuck's lap, settling his considerable bulk across the old man's legs, with the same expectation of welcome and comfort that he had shown. As a vulnerable cub, the ancient armchair groaned ominously under their combined weight, tilting at precarious angles. But Chuck never had the heart to discourage this cherished ritual that connected them to their earliest days together. Leo's attachment to his childhood toys remained equally strong and fiercely protective throughout his development. A soft leather ball that Chuck had given him during his first month at the cabin became Leo's most prized possession, carried from room to room and zealously guarded against any perceived threats to its security. When a visiting nurse once innocently picked up the ball to move it during a routine health inspection, Leo's reaction was swift, dramatic, and unequivocal. He chased the startled woman down the hallway, producing howls of protest that could be heard throughout the conservation center, and brought staff running from every direction, just like a kid who lost his teddy bear. Chuck chuckled as he retrieved the treasured ball and returned it to Leo, who immediately calmed and began his ritualistic examination to ensure his beloved toy remained undamaged and secure. By Leo's second birthday, Chuck found himself wrestling with a decision that had been growing heavier on his mind for months. While Leo was undeniably healthy, happy, and deeply bonded to his human family, Chuck worried that a life spent entirely indoors, no matter how loving and well-intentioned, might be depriving the magnificent animal of experiences that were essential to his psychological and physical well-being. Big cats, even those raised from infancy by humans, carried within their genetic code the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of wild ancestors. The question that kept Chuck awake during long winter nights was whether love alone was sufficient or whether true kindness meant providing Leo with opportunities to express the natural behaviors that defined his species. Using a significant portion of his retirement savings money, he had originally intended to leave to his children. Chuck purchased a 3-acre plot of pristine, forested land adjacent to the conservation center, working closely with local contractors who specialized in wildlife facilities and consulting with animal behavior experts from universities across the region. He designed and built what could only be described as a luxury wilderness retreat, tailored specifically for Leo's unique needs and personality. Half of the enclosure remained in its completely natural state dense forest, populated with mature pines and aspens that provided excellent climbing opportunities, rocky outcroppings that offered elevated vantage points for surveying territory, and a small stream that meandered through the space, providing fresh water and opportunities for the kind of play that big cats instinctively enjoyed. The other half featured a carefully designed shelter that combined the comforts Leo had known with the rugged aesthetics of wilderness living, complete with his familiar armchair, his collection of beloved toys, and of course, the extensively modified blue-striped shirt that continued to serve as his primary security blanket. The transition from indoor domestic life to semi-wild living proved more challenging than Chuck had anticipated. Despite all his careful planning and preparation, Leo's initial reaction to the move bordered on panic, a response that caught Chuck off guard, given how much thought had gone into making the new environment welcoming and familiar. Despite the beautiful natural surroundings and the presence of all his favorite possessions, Leo refused to eat, spent his days hiding under the familiar furniture that had been transported from Chuck's cabin, and produced heartbroken vocalizations that could be heard throughout the conservation center. Recognizing that his own presence was the critical factor in Leo's ability to adjust to his new home, Chuck made the decision to temporarily abandon his own comfortable cabin and move into the shelter with Leo. For the first week, they were essentially camping together in luxury, with Chuck cooking simple meals on a portable stove, reading aloud to Leo in the evenings, just as he had done when the Leopard was a tiny cub, and maintaining all their familiar routines in this new setting. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Leo's natural curiosity began to overcome his anxiety about the changes in his environment. Tentative explorations of the immediate area around the shelter expanded into longer expeditions through the forested section of his new territory. Chuck watched with a mixture of pride and melancholy as Leo discovered the sheer joy of climbing towering pine trees, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his spotted coat as he navigated branches that would have challenged much smaller and more traditionally arboreal cats. The sight of Leo in his natural element was nothing short of breathtaking. Gone was any trace of the uncertain, clingy behavior that had characterized his indoor life. In the forest, he moved with the fluid grace and quiet confidence that millions of years of evolution had bred into his ancestors, every sense alert and engaged with his environment in ways that domestic life could never have provided. Yet each evening, without fail, he would return to the shelter and curl up beside Chuck's chair, purring contentedly, as if to communicate that no amount of wilderness adventure could replace the comfort and security of his chosen family. The next phase of Leo's development brought a surprise that Chuck had not anticipated, though in retrospect, he realized he probably should have been prepared for the possibility. One crisp morning in early spring, he arrived at the shelter to find Leo pacing excitedly along the fence line that bordered the conservation center's property, his attention focused intently on something moving through the trees on the other side. Following Leo's intense gaze, Chuck spotted another big cat, a female leopard, who appeared to be observing their daily routine with equal fascination and interest. Dr. Martinez quickly identified the newcomer as Zara, a rescued leopard who had been confiscated from an illegal private collection in Nevada several months earlier. She had been living in a temporary enclosure at the conservation center, while the staff searched for a suitable permanent placement, but like Leo, she had been raised in captivity from a young age. and would never be suitable for release into genuinely wild conditions. Unlike Leo, however, she had received minimal socialization with humans and remained wary and defensive around people, making her placement options extremely limited. The romance that developed between Leo and Zara unfolded with all the sweetness, uncertainty, and gradual trust building of any meaningful relationship. Leo would spend hours each day displaying for her through the fence that separated them, rolling on his back in the most appealing manner possible, bringing her carefully selected gifts of interesting rocks or perfectly shaped fallen branches, and producing the most melodious and complex vocalizations Chuck had ever heard from him. These sounds seemed to combine purring, chirping, and a low rumbling that Chuck could only describe as big cat conversation. Zara, for her part, gradually warmed to Leo's persistent and gentle courtship efforts. What began as cautious observation from a distance evolved into tentative approaches to the fence line, where she would eventually touch noses with Leo and engage in what appeared to be extended conversations conducted in a language of sounds and scent exchanges that no human could fully understand, but that clearly carried deep meaning for both participants. After several weeks of this cross-fence courtship, and following extensive discussions among the Conservation Center staff about the potential benefits and risks, the decision was made to introduce Zara into Leo's enclosure under careful veterinary supervision. The meeting, which Chuck watched with the nervous energy of a father observing his child's first serious romantic relationship, exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. Leo immediately began showing Zara around his territory with obvious pride and joy, leading her to his favorite climbing trees, demonstrating the best vantage points for observing the surrounding landscape, and even attempting to share his treasured leather ball. Though he drew a firm line at actually allowing her to play with his most precious possession, Zara, despite her previous wariness around humans, seemed to understand that Chuck represented safety and kindness, gradually accepting his presence, and eventually even enjoying the gentle ear scratches that Leo found so irresistible. Chuck found himself adjusting to a new dynamic in his relationship with Leo that required both patience and understanding. While the bond between them remained as strong and fundamental as ever, Leo now had responsibilities and interests that extended beyond their small, exclusive family unit. He still insisted on his evening cuddle sessions and continued to sleep with his modified blue shirt. But these cherished rituals now often included Zara, who slowly learned to trust Chuck's gentle presence and even began to seek out his attention as Leo matured into full adulthood, developing the magnificent muscular build and confident bearing of a prime male leopard. Another unexpected development emerged that would transform his role within the larger conservation community. The Wildlife Center began using Leo's spacious enclosure as a temporary placement facility for orphaned big cat cubs, while permanent homes were being arranged. To everyone's amazement and delight, Leo immediately appointed himself as mentor and surrogate older brother to these frightened, traumatized youngsters. Watching Leo guide a nervous tiger cub up its first tree or demonstrate proper stalking technique to a confused young mountain lion filled Chuck with a pride that was difficult to articulate. The once rejected cub, who had required constant reassurance and the security of a flannel shirt, had grown into a confident, nurturing leader who seemed to understand instinctively what each newcomer needed to begin healing from their own traumatic experiences. The younger cats responded to Leo's guidance with immediate trust and respect, as if recognizing in him a kindred spirit who had survived his own difficult beginning and emerged stronger. "He's got your touch," Dr. Martinez observed one afternoon as they watched Leo patiently encouraging a recently rescued lynx kitten to try solid food for the first time since its rescue. That same ability to sense exactly what an animal needs and provide it without overwhelming them with too much attention or pressure. Chuck nodded thoughtfully, though he wondered privately whether Leo's remarkable therapeutic ability stemmed less from inheriting human traits and more from his unique perspective As an animal who had experienced both complete rejection and unconditional love, perhaps having walked so close to the edge of abandonment and death, made him particularly sensitive to the fears and needs of other orphan creatures who found themselves in similar circumstances. By the third winter of Leo's life in the forest enclosure, a comfortable and deeply satisfying routine had established itself around their extended family. Chuck would arrive each morning to find Leo and Zara waiting expectantly by the shelter entrance. Ready to share breakfast and plan the day's activities with their human patriarch, Leo still insisted on wearing his extensively modified blue shirt, though it now required industrial-strength modifications and regular repairs. To accommodate his impressive adult size and strength, more often than not, Zara would curl up contentedly on one side of Chuck's ancient armchair, while Leo claimed his traditional spot sprawled across Chuck's lap, creating a tableau that never failed to bring smiles to the faces of visitors and researchers who came to study their unique social dynamic. The Conservation Center had become something of a destination for wildlife professionals, interested in documenting the success of Leo's mentorship program and attempting to understand the psychological and behavioral mechanisms that made him so remarkably effective with traumatized animals for Chuck. However, the scientific accolades and research attention were secondary to the simple daily joy of watching Leo thrive in ways that exceeded every hope he had held during those desperate early days. The hollow-eyed, rejected cub, who had once required the scent of a flannel shirt to feel safe enough to take nourishment, had grown into a magnificent, confident animal who served as a beacon of hope and healing for dozens of other rescued cats who passed through their sanctuary. Yet beneath all that growth, maturity, and newfound responsibility, Leo remained fundamentally the same. Loving soul, who had chosen Chuck as his father on that pivotal day when survival itself had hung in the balance. On quiet evenings when the research teams had departed and the Conservation Center had settled into its peaceful nighttime routine, Chuck would sit in his familiar chair with Leo's great head resting heavily on his knee, just as it had when the leopard was small enough to fit entirely in his lap. Snow would fall in soft, silent curtains beyond the shelter's windows, transforming the forest into a winter wonderland that sparkled under the security lights. But inside their warm sanctuary, contentment and love reigned supreme. These moments represented the truest success of their unlikely partnership, not the scientific recognition or the other animals they had helped, but simply the profound bond between two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to be complete. "You've grown up, but you're still my baby," Chuck would whisper, his weathered hand stroking the soft fur behind Leo's ears, while Zara purred softly from her spot on the armchair. Leo never answered with words, of course, but his response was always the same, a warm, rumbling purr that seemed to encompass all the love, gratitude, and deep contentment that language could never adequately express in those precious moments. As the snow continued to fall, and the forest settled into its winter sleep around them, both man and leopard understood with absolute certainty that they had discovered something truly extraordinary. A family born not of blood or species, but of need, compassion, and the remarkable healing power of unconditional love